since then, particularly on this earth, which Richard has written about so wonderfully in his books. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. That, there's no doubt in my mind, that is true.
I think it's wonderful that Richard should say that, and probably most of your...
Very perceptive fellow.
Most of your colleagues in the Church of England, at least, would probably say the same. But I must say, I wish you guys would get out there and do something about your congregations, because it's not enough to say a few bishops and theologians support evolution. Of course they do. But the vast majority, at least in the United States, and increasingly here, of the people in the pew, and even more on the prayer mat, are simple, Genesis-believing, naive young earth creationists. And that's very worrying and ought to worry bishops, at least as much as scientists. And I wonder whether you think that you and your colleagues are doing enough to correct the misconceptions among your flocks. And I don't mean just positively, I think I also mean standing up in the pulpit and preaching a sermon in which you may refer to Adam and Eve and the fall. And if anybody challenges you, you'll say, oh, of course, it's only an allegory, it's only symbolic, it's only metaphorical. But how many of the congregation know it's only an allegory? And that's what worries me, because there's this kind of tendency for preachers generally to assume that everybody knows that what they're talking about is symbolic and allegorical, and overlook the fact that their audience is actually taking it literally as
Why does that matter, though?
Because it's false.
Well, why does that matter? Some credulous fools choose to believe something that is untrue. Why does it matter?
Because they're missing such an enormous amount, because the truth is so wonderful and so exciting, as Richard will agree.
Yes, and also it's because a literalistic view of the Bible totally misunderstands what the Bible is about. And it is important to understand that the Bible is a particular kind of literature which conveys particular kinds of truth through poetry, through myth, and through story. And I think it's very important to people to understand what the Bible is about. But I can assure you, Richard, I preached on Darwin last Sunday, straight down the line, and
You probably wrote that for him too.
And I think probably most members of the Church of England do have no problem at all believing in the theory of evolution. I did get one very furious email afterwards, and I had to write back and say that, you know, with all respect, I just couldn't believe, didn't think there could be a meeting of minds, because her fundamental premises were so different from mine. But you're quite right, it is a worrying situation in the country. The latest opinion polls show that only about 50% of the population believe in the theory of evolution, and certainly amongst young evangelical Christians and young Muslims, there is still a strong creationist belief. Teachers find that in schools, apparently. That's why this whole question of whether creationism should be taught in schools has arisen so sharply, because apart from anything else, teachers have found in their science classes there are people who actually take that view.
Well, that is very worrying. And,
it is worrying.
And you and I, of course, collaborated in trying to do something about that. But I want to come back to what you were saying about what the Bible really is, what Genesis really is. It's symbolic, it's mythical, it's poetic. That's a convenient thing to say in the 21st century, and because that's the best you can say of it. But do you think the authors thought it was? I mean, didn't the people who wrote Genesis believe it?
Well, I think that the authors who wrote what we call the Bible were very well aware that the Bible contains many different kinds of literature. I mean, obviously, apart from else, you've got letters in it, the letters of St. Paul. You've got biographies, the Gospels. In the Torah, the Hebrew Scripture, you've got laws for living of all kinds.
No, but talk about Genesis, because that's...
Well, Genesis, I think it'd be true to say that many of the patristic fathers, people like Augustine, interpret... Well, first of all, they thought that what we would call the literal interpretation of the Bible was not the most important. The most important was the allegorical and the spiritual and the moral. The spiritual and moral truths you got from it. So they weren't interested so much in the literal side. And St. Augustine, for example, like a lot of other people, thought that when Genesis referred to day, of course it wasn't a human kind of day. It was a God's kind of day, which was a very, very long time. So it wasn't what we would call a straightforward literalism.
When Jesus told parables, there's no question about it. He knew that it was a parable he was telling, and he didn't expect his audience to take it literally. He knew it was a parable. But although Augustine may well have interpreted Genesis as an allegory, how did he know, and how do you know, that the Bronze Age anonymous authors who originally, well, it came from Babylonian myths, I think, it doesn't seem plausible to me that you can automatically assume that because something is a holy book, that the authors of it intended it to be allegorical, when most people who read it throughout history have interpreted it literally. And why wouldn't you interpret it literally?
Well, anybody who does literature knows that any piece of literature gets reinterpreted in every generation, and what we receive is always a reinterpretation of a reinterpretation of a reinterpretation. That is the nature of literature. And it doesn't really, frankly, matter so much what they meant, if that is ever recoverable, and that is really rather doubtful. What is much more important is what we actually think it means to us today. And that account in the book of Genesis, from a religious point of view, is saying that the whole universe, moment by moment, is dependent upon a power beyond itself. And there is an ultimate divine fiat, which is expressed in that kind of story way. You and I have just had the privilege of listening to a wonderful performance of Haydn's Creation, which I think was specially put on for your honour, Richard, because we knew that you'd want to begin this evening by listening to some words of Scripture and hearing how wonderful they were. Now, listening to that's not science. But it is saying, first of all, there is something awesome and wonderful about the universe, which I know you believe in very strongly. And I'd like to get on that at some point, because you've described yourself in public on film as, in some sense, a deeply religious man. And I'm sure that for you, as for me, in Haydn's Creation, something of that sense of awe and wonder before the universe was expressed.
My feeling was that even the wonderful music of Haydn couldn't disguise the banality of the words that we were listening to. We need great poetry to express the wonder of the universe, but Genesis isn't it. Or if it is, there's nothing special about it. You could go to the origin myths of any people, ask any anthropologist.
But I think I disagree with you on literary grounds there. Let there be light. And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. You can't do better than that.
I think we're just going to have to agree to differ on that.
Is there a problem for you as a bishop in telling your congregation, or what is it bishops have? Dioceses, don't they? I mean, anyway, telling your flock that part of the Bible is clearly not meant to be believed, and parts apparently are meant to be believed.
Which is which? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, people believe things in different ways.
But it's not true. I mean, you've just said.
Well, there are different kinds of truth. There are moral truths, there's spiritual truths, there's the truths of history, and there are the truths of science. The Bible is not about the truths of science. It does contain some historical truths, but it fundamentally contains some religious truths written from the standpoint of Judaism and Christianity, that there is something very special about us human beings, that we are made in the image of God. That is the sense we can think and know that we're thinking, we can choose, we're conscious of moral choice, we can pray, and that there is an ultimately wise rationality behind this universe who desires to enter into a relationship with us. That's what the Bible is
Well, is the
about.
resurrection a myth as well?
I don't believe the